Afternoon heat shimmered across the dusty road like water that would never quench your thirst. Constance Hartwell stood beside a red and white spotted cow, her fingers blistered from gripping the rope, her throat dry from speaking words of encouragement that the stubborn animal refused to acknowledge. 3 months. It had been exactly 3 months since her husband Frederick passed away from a sudden fever that the doctor said was unpredictable, unavoidable, and absolutely fatal. 3 months since the world had collectively decided that a widow without means was no longer worth their time or consideration. The church ladies who had brought casseroles stopped visiting after the first month passed. The neighbors who had offered help disappeared like morning fog burning away in the sun. Even the shopkeeper, who had known Frederick for 20 years and had sold him goods on credit during difficult seasons, suddenly found reasons to be in the back room whenever Constance entered his store. It was a rejection that cut deeper than any spoken words ever could have cut. Her daughter Rosemary was waiting at home, only 7 years old, with dark eyes that watched her mother's face for signs of hope or despair, mirroring her emotions like a still pond reflects the sky. Constance had spent every penny of her widow's allowance on this single cow. It was a desperate gamble, a calculated risk with the only currency she possessed, her remaining savings and her unwavering determination to survive. With milk and butter and cheese, she could survive another year. Maybe 2 if she was careful and resourceful. She could keep the small house on the edge of town that had belonged to her husband's family for 3 generations. She could give Rosemary something approaching a normal childhood, something resembling security and stability in an uncertain world, but the cow had other plans entirely. "Please," Constance whispered, pulling harder on the frayed rope. Her voice cracked with something beyond frustration. It cracked with desperation, with the weight of months of carrying everything alone. "Please just come home with me." The animal snorted and planted its hooves more firmly into the earth, as immovable as stone, as resistant as fate itself. Constance closed her eyes. The sun beat down on her shoulders with relentless heat, and she could feel the weight of everything she was carrying alone pressing down like a physical force. When Frederick was alive, people smiled at her. They asked her opinions. She mattered, but that version of Constance seemed to have died along with her husband. That's when she heard the horse. It came from behind her, a slow, measured approach from around the bend where the road curved past Miller's old property. Constance's instinct was to make herself smaller, to draw inward, to become invisible. She had learned that lesson well in the past 3 months. The horse stopped beside her, and from the corner of her eye she could see expensive boots, worn leather chaps darkened by years of use, and a man whose shadow fell across her like an unexpected mercy from heaven itself. The man's name was Nathaniel Harrow. He was tall, perhaps mid-40s, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and eyes that held the complicated wisdom of someone who had lived through multiple seasons of loss and come out changed. His face was weathered by sun and experience, but there was nothing harsh about his expression. Instead, there was something inherently gentle about the way he carried himself, a man who understood that the world could be cruel. "That cow's not afraid of you," Nathaniel said, his voice low and measured like honey poured slowly. "She's afraid of what comes next. She's afraid of the unknown, of change, of whether she'll be safe in a new place." Constance didn't look at him. "I'm managing perfectly well, thank you very much." "I didn't say you weren't," Nathaniel replied, dismounting with fluid grace. "I said the cow's afraid. There's a world of difference between those two things. You see, understanding what's really happening is the first step toward solving any problem." He walked toward the animal slowly, from the side rather than directly ahead. His movements were deliberate, non-threatening, calculated to reassure rather than alarm. He wore spurs that jingled softly with each step, and his hands remained visible and open, unthreatening. "Easy, girl," he murmured, extending his hand so the cow could smell him first. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you. You're just heading to a new home where someone will take good care of you. Someone who understands what it's like to be afraid." There was something in his voice, something almost ancient in its understanding of how to calm a frightened creature. Constance watched despite her resolve as the cow's muscles relaxed, tension draining from her shoulders like water from a broken pitcher. "What's your name?" Nathaniel asked, still addressing the cow but clearly directing his question elsewhere. Constance Hartwell, she replied quietly, almost reluctantly. Nathaniel Harrow, and this here is a good animal. She's coming from somewhere that made her distrustful. Takes time to rebuild that trust. Patience, consistency, kindness. All the things that seem to be in short supply these days. He ran his hand along the cow's neck, speaking in those low, soothing tones that seemed to contain ancient understanding. Within moments, the animal was walking beside him as if they were old friends taking an evening constitutional. Constance found herself following, unable to do anything else, drawn forward by something she couldn't quite name. They walked for a long time without speaking. The only sounds were hoofbeats, footsteps, and the wind moving through the cottonwood trees that lined the road. As they walked, the sun continued its descent, painting the landscape in progressively warmer tones. Gold became amber, became crimson. Constance found her breathing becoming easier. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for 3 months began to loosen slightly. She wasn't being judged, she wasn't being pitied, she was simply being allowed to walk, to exist, to be present in another person's space without apology. "You heading to Miller's Bend?" Nathaniel finally asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "My cottage is just beyond there," Constance said. "It belonged to my husband's family. It's all I have left now." "Frederick Hartwell's widow," Nathaniel said, and it wasn't a question. His tone suggested he had done his research, that he understood something of her situation. She stiffened. "You knew my husband?" "No," Nathaniel replied. "But I was in town 3 days ago. I heard about Frederick, and I heard about his widow too, how she was trying to build something from nothing, how she'd bought a cow and was determined to make it work despite everyone telling her it was impossible." "People gossip," Constance said bitterly, her defensiveness rising like a wall between them. "They do," Nathaniel agreed with genuine understanding. "But not usually kindly. The fact that anyone mentioned you at all means you made an impression. And not the kind people dismiss easily. That takes a particular kind of strength, the kind that people who are comfortable in their own lives find threatening." They walked in silence for a while longer, the sun descending in a slow arc across the sky, painting everything in shades of honey and amber and rose. "I lost my wife," Nathaniel said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. 12 years ago. She died bringing our son into the world. It was supposed to be a simple birth. The midwife said everything was normal. She delivered dozens of babies without incident, and then it wasn't normal anymore. He paused, and Constance could hear the echo of old grief in his voice. "It was the kind of loss that the world understands," he continued. "Death in childbirth, people nod sympathetically and then move on with their lives, but it was still loss. It was still devastating. It was still the kind of thing that makes you question everything you thought you knew about fairness and justice." Constance looked at him then. There was a depth of loss in his eyes that suggested he understood exactly what it meant to have the world turn away, to be deemed unworthy, to carry grief alone. "I'm very sorry," she said, and she meant it with a depth that surprised her. "So am I," Nathaniel replied. "But you know what I learned from all that time alone? Grief doesn't require solitude. It doesn't need isolation to be valid. Sometimes grief just needs to be witnessed. It needs to be acknowledged by another human being who understands that loss isn't something you recover from. It's something you incorporate. It becomes part of who you are." They reached the cottage just as the sky turned deep purple and gold. It was modest, with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged slightly on one side, but it was home, the only home Constance had left in this world. The front door burst open, and Rosemary came running out, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner. She stopped short when she saw the stranger, suddenly shy and uncertain. "Mama!" she cried. "Mama! Where have you been? I was scared." Constance knelt down and pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tight. When she looked up, she found Nathaniel watching them with an expression of such profound tenderness that it took her breath away. She had seen that expression before, only in Frederick's eyes. "This is Mr. Harrow," Constance said, straightening up. "He helped bring home our cow." "Her name's Millicent," Nathaniel added, and Rosemary's eyes widened with delight. "She's going to be a good friend to you both. She's smart, and she's kind, and she'll give you good milk for butter and cheese. I think you two are going to understand each other very well." As the evening shadows deepened, Nathaniel helped Constance settle Millicent in the small pen behind the house. He showed Rosemary how to approach the animal without startling her, how to let Millicent know through calm, steady movements that she was safe and cared for. He helped Constance understand the proper way to milk a cow, his large hands gentle as he guided her movements. By the time the stars began to emerge, Rosemary had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, her small hand wrapped around a cup of warm milk. The expression on her face was the most peaceful Constance had seen in months. "You'll come back?" Constance asked as Nathaniel prepared to leave, and the question escaped before she could stop it. She immediately regretted the words, terrified that she had frightened him away with her vulnerability. Nathaniel paused at the gate. "I'll come back tomorrow morning. This cow's going to need help settling in, and I noticed your fence could use repairs. I'll bring supplies from town. We'll fix it together." True to his word, Nathaniel came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He came with sunrise, when the world was still soft and quiet. He came with supplies in his saddlebags, nails and wood and rope. He came with patience that seemed inexhaustible, and a genuine interest in Constance's well-being that went far beyond simple politeness. True to his word, Nathaniel helped with the fence, showing her how to mend it properly so it would last through the harsh winter months. He brought seed from town, vegetables that could grow in her garden despite the challenging climate. He fixed the porch railing that had been threatening to collapse. He patched a leak in the roof that Constance had been secretly terrified might grow worse. On the 5th day, he arrived with a second cow, a milk goat, and a crate containing 6 chickens. "Where did these come from?" Constance gasped, her voice a mixture of wonder and alarm. "My sister Eleanor," Nathaniel said simply. "She lives over in the county proper. She's been wanting to help someone in need, and I mentioned a particularly proud and stubborn widow who wouldn't accept direct charity but might accept animals that needed good homes, animals that had their own value independent of charity." Constance wanted to protest, but Nathaniel had a way of making refusal seem ungracious. And the truth was, she needed those animals more than she needed her pride. A rhythm developed over the following weeks. Nathaniel would arrive in the late afternoon bringing supplies or accomplishing repairs. Rosemary began to follow him around like a small shadow, asking endless questions about animals and farming and why the sky was blue. He answered every single question with infinite patience. Constance found herself beginning to hope. Hope was a dangerous emotion. It could be taken away, shattered, proven foolish. But with each day that Nathaniel returned, with each small act of kindness that asked nothing in return, she found her heart opening, despite her efforts to protect it. One evening, as Constance was preparing a simple supper of vegetables and bread, Nathaniel mentioned that his sister Eleanor was coming to visit. She had recently lost her own husband to illness, and she was struggling with her own grief and isolation. "Eleanor's been dealing with something similar to what you're experiencing," Nathaniel said carefully. "Her husband Thomas died nearly 6 months ago. The community has been unkind to her as well. I thought perhaps you two might benefit from each other's company. Sometimes it helps to know that you're not alone in your suffering, that someone else truly understands what you're going through." Constance's heart warmed at the suggestion. The thought of meeting another woman who had experienced such loss and rejection felt like a lifeline, but she also felt nervous. What if they didn't get along? What if Eleanor judged her as harshly as the rest of the community had? But she agreed, because that was what one did when offered kindness, and because something in her longed for the companionship of another woman who truly understood her circumstances. Eleanor arrived on a Saturday morning in a modest wagon pulled by a single horse. She was perhaps 5 years younger than Constance, with auburn hair and eyes that held the same haunted quality that Constance saw in her own reflection, the eyes of someone who had been deemed invisible and unworthy. Eleanor was tentative at first, her manner cautious and withdrawn. But as the morning progressed, as they worked together to tend the animals and prepare food, something shifted between them. They began to share their stories, the casual cruelties of the community, the way people who had once been friendly now crossed the street to avoid them, the endless struggle to maintain dignity in the face of such rejection. "My husband died 6 months ago," Eleanor said quietly, as they sat on the porch, watching Rosemary play with Eleanor's own young son Thomas. "And I felt like the world ended. But the worst part wasn't his death. It was the way everyone treated me afterward, like I had become contagious, like grief was something that could spread. They stopped seeing me, Constance replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I was a person, a woman with thoughts and opinions and value, and then Frederick died, and suddenly I was just a widow. That's all I was to them. That's all I became. Eleanor reached over and took Constance's hand. You're not just a widow, she said firmly. You're a woman who survived. You're a woman who kept going. You're a woman who bought a cow and refused to give up despite everything telling you that you should. That takes more strength than most people will ever possess. That afternoon, Nathaniel watched from a distance as the two women worked side by side in Constance's garden, planting seeds for the next season. He saw the way Eleanor's expression lightened as she and Constance laughed together. Genuine laughter, not the polite kind, but the kind that came from deep understanding and shared experience. When Eleanor prepared to leave as the sun began to set, she and Constance embraced for a long moment. I'd like to come back, Eleanor said, if you'd want me to, if you'd like company. I would like that very much, Constance replied. I would like that more than you know. After Eleanor left, Nathaniel found Constance standing alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. You and Eleanor seem to connect, Nathaniel said quietly, coming to stand beside her. She understands, Constance replied, in a way that no one else possibly could. She knows what it's like to be invisible. She knows what it's like to have the world turn away. I had a thought, Nathaniel said carefully. Eleanor has a larger house in the county proper, but it's too much for her to manage alone. And you have this cottage, which is too small for you to expand the dairy business the way you want to. What if you two became business partners? What if you combined your resources and your strengths? Constance turned to look at him, her eyes widening with possibility. She could contribute capital, Nathaniel continued, and you could contribute your knowledge and determination. Together you could create something substantial, something that would support both families, something that would prove to this community that two widows, working together, can build something of real value. Over the following weeks, the plan took shape. Eleanor and Constance began to spend more time together, discussing the possibilities, planning the expansion of the dairy operation. They would combine Eleanor's savings with Constance's knowledge and vision. They would move the operation to Eleanor's larger property, which had better grazing land and more space for expansion. Nathaniel helped with the physical labor of the move, recruiting his brother Thaddeus to assist. But the real work, the planning, the visioning, the decision-making, that was all Constance and Eleanor's. As the months passed, the dairy business began to flourish. The two women worked side by side, and slowly the community began to take notice. They began to understand that these were not helpless widows dependent on charity. These were capable businesswomen building something of genuine value. Within a year, the Hartwell-Evans dairy, combining their family names, had become known throughout the region for the quality of its products. Farmers came to ask them about their methods. Other women came to ask them about business and independence. Eleanor moved into a small house on the property so that she and Constance could work together more easily. And their children, Rosemary and Thomas, became like siblings, growing up together in an environment of mutual support and understanding. Nathaniel became a frequent visitor, and over time, a deep and genuine friendship developed between the three of them. He brought supplies, helped with repairs, and offered counsel when needed. But more importantly, he had become family in the truest sense, not by blood, but by choice and commitment. On the day they officially registered their business with the county, Constance and Eleanor stood together in the courthouse, holding the official papers that declared them business partners and equals under the law. "We did it," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We actually did it. We built something real." Constance squeezed her friend's hand. "We did, and we did it together." That evening, Nathaniel invited both women to dinner at his home. His brother Thaddeus and sister-in-law Adelaide were there as well, along with several other friends who had come to recognize and respect the two widows. As they sat around the dinner table, sharing food and laughter and genuine companionship, Constance reflected on how much her life had changed in a single year. She had gone from being invisible to being seen, from being alone to having family, not just Rosemary, but Eleanor as well, and Nathaniel, and Thaddeus and Adelaide, and all the people who had come to respect what she and Eleanor had built together. Nathaniel stood and raised a glass. "To Constance and Eleanor," he said, his voice warm with genuine affection. "To two women who refused to be broken by loss. To two women who saw in each other not competition or threat but partnership and strength. To two women who have shown this community what is possible when we choose to support each other instead of turning away." Everyone raised their glasses, and as the celebration continued around her, Constance found herself thinking about that dusty road, that stubborn cow, and the stranger who had stopped to ask why. Nathaniel had become her brother, her confidant, her truest friend. And in helping her, he had helped Eleanor as well. In connecting two wounded women, he had helped them both discover that healing doesn't come from romantic love alone. It comes from being truly seen, truly valued, and truly supported by those who understand your struggles. Years later, when Constance was an old woman, she would sit with her grandchildren and tell them the story of the day their great-uncle Nathaniel stopped on a dusty road. "He could have ridden past," she would say. "He could have ignored me and my stubborn cow, but he didn't. He asked why, and that question changed everything. Not because he saved me, I didn't need saving, but because he helped me find my sister. He helped me find Eleanor." "What made him stop?" her grandchildren would ask. "Because he understood something very important," Constance would reply. "He understood that sometimes the most important thing we can do for another person is not to save them, but to help them find their people, to help them discover that they're not alone, to create connections that matter. That's a kind of love that's just as powerful as any other kind." Rosemary grew up to become a teacher, and Thomas became a skilled farmer. Together, they helped manage and expand the dairy business, which by that time had become one of the most successful operations in the region. Eleanor eventually wrote a small book about the history of the business, detailing how two widows had come together and built something of lasting value. The book became something of a sensation, with women from all over the country writing to ask for advice on starting their own businesses, their own partnerships. Constance and Eleanor lived well into their old age, their friendship deepening with each passing year. They lived in adjoining houses on the property, close enough to work together easily but with enough separation to maintain their individual households. They raised their children together, built their business together, and faced life's challenges together. When Constance finally passed away, at the age of 83, Eleanor was holding her hand. And when Eleanor followed her 6 months later, it was Rosemary and Thomas who held each other as they grieved the loss of two remarkable women, whose friendship had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who knew them. Nathaniel lived to see both his dear friends pass, and he carried their memory with him until his own death many years later. On his deathbed, surrounded by the children and grandchildren of both Constance and Eleanor, he spoke of that day on the dusty road. "I thought I was stopping to help a widow," he said, his voice soft but clear. "But what I was really doing was helping two women find each other. And that connection they forged, that sisterhood they created, that was the real miracle. That was the real grace." And it was true. Because sometimes, the greatest love stories aren't about romantic love. Sometimes they're about the bonds that form between women who have suffered together, who have faced the world's cruelty together, and who have chosen to build something beautiful together. Sometimes they're about sisterhood.